Henry VIII wrote an epic of destruction across England, a tale forged with 6 wives, a kingdom on its knees, and a king whose ego burned brighter than his crown. There was a time in England's history when the kingdom was ruled not by love, but by one man's ego, desire, and madness for power. On a mist-soaked dawn of 1491, a child was born whose very first cry carried the storm of the future. That child's name, Henry Tudor. He was not born for the crown, yet destiny dragged him into a world of kingdoms, wars, conspiracies, and the shattered fates of 6 women. England did not yet know this red-haired, blue-eyed boy would one day break the kingdom itself with the curse of his own heart and hunger for power. This is not just the story of a king, this is the fire that burned an empire, where love was a political weapon, marriage was a battlefield, and the lives of women hung by a fragile thread, tied to a single man's whims. Welcome to the blood-stained court of the Tudors, where every crown hides betrayal, and every smile hides a blade. If history filled with life, politics, and royal madness draws you in, don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment, because this royal storm has only just begun. A king raised for power, driven by desire, and destroyed by destiny. In the mist-covered dawn of Old England, a child was born, a child whose fate held an empire. Conspiracies, love, betrayal, and a history written in blood. His name was Henry Tudor, the future Henry VIII. But even though he was born to be a king, he was never meant to be king from the beginning. The story of an unwanted second son. Henry was the second son of King Henry VII, meaning he was not the primary heir to the throne. The kingdom, the power, the state, everything was reserved for his elder brother, Arthur. Henry was entirely different. Literature, music, dance, sports. He was the perfect example of the Renaissance. He was growing up in a world of art and luxury, free from the burdens of kingship. Not the harsh life of rulers, rather an aristocratic, relaxed, intelligent childhood. But wherever history begins to look beautiful, that is exactly where it starts to break. At the age of 14, fate struck like lightning. Henry's elder brother, Prince Arthur, had married the Spanish Princess Catherine of Aragon. This marriage was a major political event in Europe, sealing the Spain-England alliance. But only 6 months after the wedding, Prince Arthur died. In a single moment, everything changed. Young Henry, who had never felt the pressure of becoming king, suddenly stood as the only heir to the throne. And a new chapter of drama began. Politics said he must marry his brother's wife. Catherine of Aragon was now a widow. Spain did not want the alliance to collapse. England didn't want it either. The political board declared Henry must marry Catherine. Catherine claimed that her marriage with Arthur had not been physically consummated, which meant, under the rules of the church, she was still eligible. The church agreed. The kingdom agreed. Henry, still a teenager, perhaps half understanding and half pressured, bowed his head. This was Henry VIII's first wife, Catherine of Aragon. The story began here. But nothing ended here. Catherine of Aragon, the queen who waited, loved, and lost. Catherine of Aragon was born a princess, raised beneath the golden sunlight of Spain, surrounded by tapestries, Tudors, and the expectation that one day she would help bind kingdoms together. Her childhood was shaped by discipline, devotion, and the quiet steel of duty. To many, she was the perfect blend of royal elegance and unshakable faith, grace wrapped in determination. She grew up knowing that her life was not her own. She would belong to a throne, to a crown, and ultimately to history. Her destiny, however, was far more turbulent than any prophecy could predict. Catherine first arrived in England as the bride of Prince Arthur, the heir to the Tudor throne. She came adorned in Spanish finery, speaking carefully rehearsed English phrases, prepared to be the future Queen of England. Yet within months, tragedy shattered every expectation. Arthur, young, hopeful, full of royal promise, was dead. And Catherine, barely out of girlhood, was left a widow in a foreign land. Most women in her position would have been sent home. But politics has a way of claiming people long before love or grief can. Spain needed its alliance with England. England needed Spain's support just as desperately. And so Catherine remained, waiting, uncertain, suspended between crowns and continents. Years passed. Her dowry was disputed. Her future was stalled. She lived on a thread of promises, held together only by her faith and her belief that someday her destiny would make sense again. Then came Henry. Henry, the second son, young, charismatic, glowing with the exuberance of youth. He was not meant to be king. Catherine was not meant to be his bride. But history rarely respects what was meant to be. When Prince Arthur's death suddenly pushed Henry toward the throne, the political winds shifted with a force neither kingdom could avoid. Catherine declared her earlier marriage unconsummated. The church granted approval. Diplomacy demanded unity. And so Henry married Catherine of Aragon. For Henry, she was dignity, intelligence, and royal stability. She spoke Latin, mastered diplomacy, and carried herself with a queen's grace. She had weathered storms long before she reached the English throne. Henry admired her. In the beginning, he even loved her, deeply, sincerely, almost boyishly. Their early marriage was filled with laughter, shared learning, and a kind of partnership rare among European rulers. Catherine matched Henry intellectually, spiritually, and morally. She was not a decoration at court, she was the heart of it. But the crown is a heavy weight. And the heaviest burden upon a queen's shoulders in the 16th century was the duty of producing a male heir. Catherine wanted to give Henry that heir. She prayed for it. She believed it would secure both her marriage and the future of the kingdom. But fate was unbelievably cruel. Pregnancy after pregnancy ended in heartbreak. Children were born only to die within hours or days. In the quiet corners of the palace, Catherine cried her grief privately, while the kingdom whispered, while Henry waited, while pressure built like a storm brewing in the shadows. Finally, at last, a child survived, a daughter. Princess Mary. Catherine loved Mary fiercely. She poured her heart into raising a princess who would be strong, educated, and devout. But in Henry's eyes, a daughter was not enough. The Tudor dynasty was young, fragile, and stained with the memory of civil war. A son was not simply a dream, it was a necessity. And each year that passed without a male heir chipped away at Henry's patience and Catherine's security. Still, Catherine remained the steadfast queen. She advised Henry in matters of state. She managed the kingdom when he went to war. She governed with fairness and compassion. She prayed for her marriage, fought for her daughter, and held the crown with the grace of someone who truly believed she was chosen for this role. But Henry was changing. The young, bright, idealistic king evolved into a man increasingly haunted by legacy. He began to fear that God was punishing him, that marrying his brother's widow had cursed their marriage. And in that growing fear, Henry's heart drifted. The court began to shift. New faces appeared. New whispers filled the corridors. And somewhere in the midst of this restless ambition, Henry met Anne Boleyn. For Catherine, this was not merely the rise of a rival. It was the unraveling of her world. She remained loyal, always. She refused to admit her marriage was invalid. She refused to step aside, even as Henry's frustration turned into obsession, an obsession that would ultimately fracture England itself. Catherine believed marriage was sacred. She believed love meant endurance. She believed duty meant standing firm even when the earth trembled beneath her. So she fought, not with swords, not with rebellion, but with dignity, faith, and an unbreakable core forged from years of patience and pain. At court, her allies dwindled. Henry's affection hardened into silence. Anne's influence grew. Bishops were pressured, scholars bribed, courtiers divided. And still Catherine stood her ground, insisting she was the rightful queen. Her stubbornness infuriated Henry, but it also earned her eternal respect from the people of England. When Henry finally separated from the church and declared their marriage void, Catherine was exiled from court, stripped of her title, separated from her daughter, forced into a life of quiet isolation. Yet even then, in cold palaces and lonely rooms, she signed letters as Catherine the Queen. Not out of pride, not out of defiance, but because she believed truth must be stronger than power. She died far from the court she once ruled. far from the daughter she adored, far from the man she had once loved. Yet she died with her faith unshaken, her dignity untouched, and her legacy intact. Catherine of Aragon was the queen who waited, loved, and lost, but she was also the queen who never bowed to anything except her conscience. Anne Boleyn, the woman who changed a kingdom, Anne Boleyn entered history not like a whisper, but like a spark, small, bright, and unexpectedly capable of setting a whole kingdom aflame. She was not the classic beauty poets wrote about. She was something far more dangerous, captivating, clever, and wrapped in an aura of mystery that made every man wonder what secret fire lived behind her dark eyes. At court, she moved with an elegance that was both sharp and soft, like velvet hiding a blade. She spoke French, played music, understood politics, and possessed a wit that could lift a room or slice through it. And was not a woman who simply existed. She affected the energy around her. Henry VIII had never met anyone like her. He had known women who adored him, women who obeyed him, women who softened under the weight of his charm. But and did not. When Henry approached, she retreated. When Henry offered gifts, she refused. When Henry declared admiration, she smiled lightly and walked away. It was not cruelty, it was strategy. And understood something Catherine of Aragon never had reason to learn: a king does not fall in love with what he has. A king falls in love with what he cannot reach. And so Anne made herself unreachable. Henry, accustomed to bending kingdoms and courtiers to his will, found himself suddenly powerless before a woman who would not yield. It was intoxicating. It was infuriating. It was irresistible. Soon the letters began, pages upon pages of longing, written by a king who no longer cared about dignity. He begged for her affection. He promised her a throne. He offered her jewels, estates, status, anything. But Anne wanted only one thing: not to be the king's mistress, but to be the king's wife. That demand would ignite a fire that would burn across England. Catherine of Aragon was still queen. The Pope refused to grant a divorce. The Church upheld Catherine's marriage. Every door Henry pushed against remained locked. And every day, Anne remained firm. She would not share Henry's bed until she wore his crown. For a man who believed he was chosen by God, it became more than desire. It became righteousness, destiny, obsession. So Henry did what no king had done before. He tore England away from Rome. It began quietly, scholars whispering, secret committees meeting, laws shifting like shadows across parchment. But soon the thunder grew louder. Bishops were forced to choose between the Pope and the King. Parliament became Henry's weapon. And the church that had ruled England for 1,000 years was broken. From its ashes rose a new one, the Church of England. Henry's church. Henry's power. Henry's will. All for Anne Boleyn. The world watched in stunned disbelief. Diplomats sent urgent letters home. Priests trembled. The Pope raged. But Henry only saw one thing: Anne. She had become the center of his universe, the star he dismantled empires for. Their marriage, when it finally came, was not simply a union. It was a revolution, sealed not with peace, but with defiance. And was crowned Queen of England with a ceremony so magnificent it stunned even her critics. Crowds lined the streets. Trumpets echoed across London. Gold cloth shimmered beneath the June sunlight. And sat beneath a canopy of state, triumphant, radiant, untouchable. But crowns are heavy. And the higher you rise, the harder every whisper sounds. The pressure to produce a sun hung in the air like a storm cloud. Catherine had given Henry no surviving sons. And believed she could. She had promised she could. And Henry had staked an entire kingdom on that promise. When Anne's first child was a girl, Elizabeth, Henry tried to hide his disappointment. A daughter was not a failure. But it was not the triumph he had sacrificed so much for. And felt the kingdom's breath tighten. She felt the court watching, waiting, predicting, hoping for her failure. The eyes she once dazzled now turned cold, calculating, cruel. Miscarriage followed miscarriage. Hopes rose and shattered. Henry, whose passion for Anne had once burned like wildfire, began to cool. He grew restless, irritable, wounded by fate. And in the cracks of that cooling devotion, doubts began to slip in like poison. Had God cursed this marriage too? Had Henry torn down the church for nothing? Had Anne bewitched him? Manipulated him? Led him astray? Court enemies who had once feared her sharp tongue now sensed her weakening power. Whispers swirled like smoke, dark, intoxicating, impossible to ignore. Anne argued with Henry, challenged him, demanded his loyalty. But Henry did not want a queen who fought like a king. He wanted peace, obedience, simplicity. He wanted the dream he had imagined, not the reality he had created. When another woman, Jane Seymour, entered the king's orbit and felt the inevitability, she recognized the pattern. She had once been the star that eclipsed Catherine. Now she was the queen waiting to be eclipsed. The accusations began quickly, brutally, mercilessly. Adultery, treason, incest, witchcraft. Crimes so extreme they bordered on madness. But the king needed justification, and so the kingdom created it. Trials were staged. Witnesses were coerced. Evidence was invented. And Anne, who had toppled the church without raising a sword, could not defend herself against the machinery of a king who no longer wanted her. On a cold morning in May, Anne Boleyn walked to her execution dressed in dignity. Her steps were steady. Her face was serene. She forgave her accusers. She prayed for the king who had destroyed her. She spoke not as a villain, not as a victim, but as a queen. And when she knelt before the French swordsman, chosen for his swift precision, she whispered a final prayer. A moment later, history shifted. Anne Boleyn, the woman who would not yield, the woman who would not bend, the woman who altered the identity of a nation, was gone. But her legacy lived. Her daughter, the infant once dismissed as a disappointment, would grow to become Elizabeth I, one of the greatest monarchs the world has ever known. Anne's crown had cost her everything, but in the end, history remembered her not for her fall, but for the kingdom she changed. Jane Seymour, the gentle queen who gave him a son, she entered Henry VIII's life like a soft winter sunrise, quiet, pale, delicate, almost invisible, where Catherine of Aragon carried the dignity of Spain, and Anne Boleyn carried the fire of France. Jane Seymour carried silence, and sometimes, silence is the most dangerous thing of all. Jane was not born for chaos. She was not born to conquer kingdoms, challenge church laws, or rewrite political maps. She grew up in a peaceful country manor, where sunlight spilled over wooden floors, where doors creaked softly in the morning, where girls learned needlework, scripture, and the art of staying modest. Her family was respectable, pious, loyal. Nothing in her childhood foretold she would one day marry the most unpredictable king England ever had. But destiny loves irony. Jane Seymour arrived at court as a lady-in-waiting to Catherine of Aragon, then later served Anne Boleyn. She had watched it all, the stormy rise of Anne, the dramatic fall, the screams, the distrust, the broken marriage, the execution. She saw Catherine weep silently. She saw Anne fight like a flame refusing to die. And all the while Jane stayed still, simply watching, listening, remembering. Perhaps that is why Henry noticed her. Because after Catherine's endurance and Anne's fire, Henry was exhausted. His heart was a battlefield. His court was a furnace. His soul was starving for peace. And Jane Seymour looked like peace. The first glance, a king ready to break and a woman who didn't try to fix him. Henry was already drifting away from Anne long before her trial. The court whispered. The ambassadors wrote letters in code. Everyone knew his gaze had landed somewhere else. Jane Seymour walked through the palace corridors with her head lowered, hands gracefully folded in front of her. She never flirted. She never dared. She simply existed, soft, gentle, calm. That alone made her radiant to a man drowning in chaos. One day, Henry slipped a small purse of coins into her hands, a quiet gift, a king's subtle invitation. Jane did something no one expected. She handed it back. To Henry, who had always been chaste, adored, and worshipped, Jane's refusal struck like lightning. She would not be a mistress. She would not be another scandal. She would not be Anne Boleyn 2.0. If he wanted her, he had to court her with dignity. And Henry, who still hungered for honor, fell deeper. Anne's fall, Jane's rise, the tragedy of Anne Boleyn's final days unfolded like a dark play. She was arrested, tried, condemned. And in the shadows of that turmoil, Jane was being prepared. Historians debate her role. Was she innocent? Or was she part of the courtly plot? But the truth is, a quiet face can hide a determined heart. A soft voice can hide ambitions woven in silk. And was executed on a bright May morning. The sword struck, the queen fell. The crowd gasped, and England changed. But even before Anne's body was cold, Henry was already planning his future. 11 days later, he married Jane Seymour. It was so sudden, so emotionally violent, that even the most loyal courtiers felt the breath leave their lungs. But Henry needed stability, an heir, a fresh beginning, and Jane was everything that did not remind him of Anne. Wherein argued, Jane agreed. Wherein provoked, Jane soothed. Wherein dazzled, Jane disappeared. Henry called her the perfect wife. But the truth, she was the perfect contrast. Queen Jane, the gentle mediator. Once she became queen, Jane Seymour did not seek jewels, power, or courtly games. She restored something England had forgotten: warmth. She brought back modest fashions. She encouraged charity. She united the fractured court with calm diplomacy. Even Mary, Henry's estranged daughter, found hope in Jane. While Anne had rejected Mary fiercely, Jane urged Henry to reconcile with her. She didn't challenge the king, she gently persuaded him. And that was Jane's magic, soft power. Henry loved her like a man who wanted to believe in love again. He gifted her with jewels, estates, servants, anything to keep her safe and cherished. But beyond love, there was expectation. A queen had one sacred job: produce a son. The miracle of Prince Edward. For years Henry VIII had been humiliated by fate. Catherine gave him only Mary, and gave him only Elizabeth, and even lost pregnancies, each one crushing Henry's hopes. But Jane, quiet, gentle Jane, delivered what the kingdom had been waiting for. In the autumn of 1537, after long months of prayer, cautious optimism, and sleepless nights, Jane went into labor. The court held its breath. The labor lasted 3 days, 3 days of excruciating agony, 3 days of fear, prayers, and trembling midwives. And then, a cry. A prince. A healthy, perfect, living son. Prince Edward. The palace erupted like a festival. Bells rang across England. People danced in the streets. Henry wept. Yes, the king who executed wives, destroyed churches, and terrified nations, wept openly. For the first time, he had everything he ever wanted: a male heir, a queen who gave it to him, a future secured. Henry called Jane his phoenix, the woman who restored hope from ashes. But fate asked for a price. The queen who faded away, Jane had endured the brutal labor, but her body was weakening. Infection, silent, merciless, crept in. Day by day she grew pale, fragile, fading. The celebrations outside echoed through the palace, but inside Jane's chamber, there was only fear. Henry visited her often, something he did not do for Catherine or Anne in their darkest hours. He sat beside her bed, held her hand, and whispered words he had not spoken in years. She had given him a prince. She had given England stability. She had given him peace. But on October 24, 1537, less than 2 weeks after Edward's birth, Jane Seymour died. She was barely 29. Henry's grief, the only woman he truly mourned. The day Jane died, the palace fell into silence. Servants cried. Courtiers bowed their heads. And Henry VIII collapsed. This was the man who had shrugged at Catherine's suffering, the man who barely flinched when Anne was executed. But for Jane, soft, gentle Jane, he broke. He wore black for months. He cancelled festivities. He shut himself away. When he finally emerged, he looked older, not in years, but in spirit. Henry VIII would marry 3 more times. He would chase companionship, security, alliances. But none of those queens filled the quiet void Jane left behind. Years later, when Henry planned his death and burial, he made one request: he wished to be buried beside Jane Seymour. Not Catherine, not any other wife. In death, he returned to the woman who gave him what he valued most: a son, a legacy, and a brief, flickering glimpse of gentle love. Jane Seymour's legacy. She reigned for only 1 year. She wore the crown for a moment. But in that moment, she changed the Tudor destiny forever. Edward VI became king. Her family rose in influence. Her memory remained untarnished. History remembers Catherine for dignity, and for brilliance and tragedy. But Jane? Jane is remembered for quiet power, the kind that shapes a king, a kingdom, and a future, without ever raising a voice. And of Cleves, the diplomatic disaster, in the intricate chessboard of European politics, marriages were not always about love. They were contracts, alliances, promises written in gold ink and stamped with crowns. And of Cleves, a princess from the distant lands of Germany, was born into this world of strategy and diplomacy. She grew up in the courts of the Holy Roman Empire, surrounded by scholars, musicians, and tutors who taught her languages, etiquette, and the delicate art of political survival. She was intelligent, poised, and trained to navigate the treacherous waters of continental alliances. And yet nothing in her upbringing could prepare her for the storm she would encounter in England. Henry VIII, by this time, was a king seasoned in both love and tragedy. He had seen queens rise and fall, fires consume them, and crowns shattered across the palace floors. Catherine had taught him patience, and Boleyn had taught him passion. Jane Seymour had shown him the quiet miracle of a son. Now, the kingdom faced a new need. Europe was shifting. France and Spain were powerful, threatening allies and enemies alike. England needed a German connection, a Protestant alliance to balance the Catholic powers of the continent. Enter Anne of Cleves. She was chosen not for her beauty, though she possessed a refined grace, but for her position, her family, and the strategic value of her hand in marriage. Portraits were commissioned, painted by the most skilled artists of the era, and presented to Henry. He looked upon Anne's likeness with approval. In the small, controlled world of painted images, she seemed perfect. Noble, elegant, agreeable. Enough to satisfy the king, enough to secure an alliance. So the arrangements were made. Letters were signed. Ambassadors congratulated themselves. The kingdom waited. But when Anne finally arrived in England and Henry saw her in person, he recoiled. "She likes her not," he reportedly exclaimed. The king, who had destroyed kingdoms to satisfy love or obsession, now faced a match he did not desire. It was not cruelty. It was instinct, an almost visceral reaction. And Henry's instinct was law. Anne, for her part, had done nothing wrong. She had arrived dutifully, in full regalia, carrying gifts, wearing the attire of a bride ready to rule. She had learned the English language, studied customs, and prepared to meet a king she had never seen. Yet, in Henry's eyes, she failed the invisible test of attraction. The match, political as it had been, was doomed from the moment of their first meeting. The court must have held its breath. Diplomats, who had orchestrated this union with precision, suddenly felt powerless. Henry VIII's whims could overturn centuries of carefully planned strategy. And so, the marriage took place, but with all the tension of a poorly bound knot. Anne, wise beyond her years, sensed the king's lack of desire. She did not protest, argue, or challenge him. She understood the delicate balance between survival and dignity. Where Henry might have seen humiliation, she maintained composure. Where he might have unleashed fury, she offered courtesy. The marriage, while legally binding, was emotionally empty, a contract rather than a union of hearts. Yet, remarkably, the arrangement did not devolve into disaster. Anne of Cleves demonstrated a pragmatism and grace that few queens had possessed. She adapted to the English court with quiet intelligence, earning respect from nobles, courtiers, and even the king's advisors. She was not provocative, she did not intrigue for power, and she did not challenge Henry's authority. She simply existed with dignity, fulfilling her role as queen with poise. The months passed. Henry's infatuation, or lack thereof, remained unchanged. And though isolated from romantic affection, proved her worth as a neutral, non-threatening presence at court. She was courteous, learned, and politically astute. She mediated minor disputes, maintained decorum, and avoided courtly intrigue. For the first time, a queen's survival did not depend on beauty, influence, or scandal. It depended on wisdom and patience. Finally, Henry made a decision. The marriage would be annulled. But unlike the fates of Anne Boleyn or Catherine of Aragon, this was not a violent or shameful end. The separation was peaceful, deliberate, and surprisingly generous, and retained her dignity, her household, and a comfortable allowance. She was given the unprecedented title of the king's beloved sister, a reflection of Henry's unusual approval and the respect she had earned. Anne of Cleves remained in England for the rest of her life, living quietly yet comfortably. She attended court functions, maintained friendships, and became a familiar figure in the Tudor household. Henry, in later years, referred to her with fondness and gratitude, acknowledging her tact and grace. She had not given him passion, nor a child, nor political drama, but she had given him a model of peace and stability. In the context of Henry VIII's tumultuous marriages, Anne of Cleves is often overlooked. She did not face execution. She did not endure scandal. She did not bear the burden of succession crises. But her story is no less fascinating. It is the story of survival, of dignity, and of a woman who navigated a volatile court without compromising her integrity. Anne's life demonstrates a quiet but enduring influence. By refusing to provoke the king, by maintaining her composure in the face of potential humiliation, and by accepting her role with grace, she became one of the few queens who left the Tudor court without bitterness, bloodshed, or disgrace. She embodied resilience, patience, and emotional intelligence, traits that history often overlooks but which are, perhaps, more remarkable than any crown or scandal. Her legacy is subtle but profound. The annulment, though initially seen as a failure, set a precedent for legal flexibility in royal marriages. Henry's later references to Anne as a beloved sister reflect a personal respect rarely afforded to former queens. And for England, the union, brief as it was, secured the diplomatic alliance it had sought, even without the triumph of love or passion. Anne of Cleves passed away peacefully, remembered by historians as the unwilling bride who managed to survive where others perished. She transformed a potential disaster into a narrative of grace, ensuring her place in the Tudor story without ever spilling blood. In the end, Anne of Cleves teaches a lesson that contrasts sharply with the other queens of Henry VIII. Sometimes survival is the greatest power of all. One can influence kingdoms not through ambition, scandal, or conquest, but through patience, wisdom, and the quiet strength to endure. In a life dominated by kings, politics, and wars of the heart, Anne of Cleves chose peace. And history remembers her, not for fire or fury, but for elegance, dignity, and an unshakable calm that outlived the storms of the Tudor court. Catherine Howard, the young bride and the doom of desire. Catherine Howard was a breath of youth in a palace weighed down by age, disease, and the heavy hands of history. She was not a queen shaped by years of duty, or educated in the arts of diplomacy. She was 15 or 16 when she first stepped into the dangerous, gilded corridors of the Tudor court, a girl thrust into a world where every glance, every whisper, every step carried the weight of life and death. Beauty, she quickly realized, was both armor and weapon. Henry VIII, by the time Catherine entered his life, was no longer the agile, handsome, courtly man he had been. He was 49, sickly in body, irritable in mind, and haunted by the ghosts of wives past. Catherine, on the other hand, was all vitality and life. She had hair the color of golden sunlight, eyes sparkling with mischief and curiosity, and a laugh that could pierce the gloom of any room. To Henry, she was irresistible, a final blaze of youth to ignite a heart grown weary. Their first meeting was electric. Henry, accustomed to women who obeyed, Women who cowered, women who carefully measured their smiles, found Catherine to be bold, untamed, and unabashedly alive. She was unlike anyone he had ever married. And Bullen had provoked him with intellect and cunning, Jane Seymour had calmed him with patience and virtue. Catherine Howard provoked him with innocence and audacity. A dangerous combination that sent the king into both ecstasy and obsession. She, too, was caught in the whirlwind. The palace was intoxicating, lavish feasts, endless music, courtly dances, the constant hum of intrigue. And Catherine, young and inexperienced, moved through it all with a mixture of fear and delight. She understood quickly that every action in the Tudor court was scrutinized. Every smile could be interpreted, every word twisted, every touch reported. Yet she did not shrink. She thrived. And Henry, intoxicated by her vitality, rewarded her with attention, gifts, and power. Marriage came swiftly. Henry, blinded by infatuation, swept her into his world with the speed and recklessness of a storm. Catherine became queen, adorned in jewels and silks, her every whim anticipated by a king who had already demolished church authority, executed wives, and defied tradition for love and obsession. She had entered the palace as a girl, but she was crowned as a queen, a title heavy with both glory and danger. Catherine's youth and inexperience, however, were not without peril. She had been a member of the Howard household, surrounded by courtiers whose intentions were anything but innocent. Before her marriage, whispers of her flirtations and secret affairs had circulated quietly, and now, as queen, they began to resurface. Gossip is a venomous creature in the corridors of power, and in the Tudor court, it could kill as easily as a sword. Henry, who had already endured the pain of betrayal and the disappointment of daughters, demanded loyalty, devotion, and absolute submission. Catherine's past, innocent in her mind, scandalous in the eyes of the court, became a weapon in hands eager to see her fall. The young queen, once radiant with laughter and life, now walked a tightrope over a pit of suspicion, her every movement watched, her every smile interpreted. It was a perilous dance. Catherine could not conceal her charm, her vivacity, or her nature. She could not hide the spark that had first drawn Henry to her. And so the inevitable tension grew, simmering beneath the surface, invisible yet undeniable. The palace became a stage of whispers, secrets, and betrayal. Courtiers who had once flattered her now watched with thinly veiled malice. Every servant became a potential witness. Every ally could become an enemy. The queen's private life, once small and secret, began to unravel. Letters, confessions, and gossip painted a portrait that Henry could not ignore. Catherine's youthful indiscretions, boyhood promises, stolen kisses, private letters, were dragged into the harsh light of royal scrutiny. In any other court, they might have been forgotten. In Henry's court, they were death sentences waiting to be pronounced. The king's temperament, already volatile, could not withstand perceived betrayal. Henry VIII was a man who demanded absolute devotion, unquestioning obedience, and a legacy through sons. Catherine's past, however trivial it might seem in retrospect, struck at the very heart of his fears and insecurities. Suspicion became rage, and rage, once it found its spark, could consume anyone, queen or commoner alike. Investigations began quietly at first. Servants were questioned, confidants pressed for confessions. Small details, glances, letters, moments of youth, were magnified into acts of treason. Catherine, still young and inexperienced, found herself navigating a labyrinth with invisible walls, each step bringing her closer to the edge. The palace, once a place of opulence and fascination, became a cage lined with whispers, every corridor echoing with her potential downfall. Henry, torn between the memory of desire and the sting of betrayal, acted decisively. In his eyes, Catherine had violated the sacred trust of the crown. In his mind, justice demanded immediacy. Courtiers who had once fawned now plotted her ruin. Accusations mounted: adultery, conspiracy, betrayal. The charges were crafted to leave no room for escape. The queen, the once beloved young bride, now faced the machinery of a king's vengeance. The trial was swift. It was more spectacle than justice, a brutal theater of accusation, testimony, and condemnation. Witnesses, many coerced, spoke of youthful missteps and secret loves. Evidence, some real, some fabricated, was presented to a court already inclined toward a verdict. Catherine's youth and fear were met not with mercy, but with precision. The court acted as the instrument of the king's will, and the king's will was unyielding. On the morning of her execution, Catherine Howard walked to the scaffold with a mixture of terror, resignation, and fragile dignity. She was 18 or 19 years old, barely a woman in the eyes of history, yet fully a queen in the eyes of law. She knelt, prayed silently, and faced her fate with a courage she could hardly comprehend. The crowd watched, silent and uneasy, as the young queen became another victim of Henry's inexorable pursuit of control and legacy. The executioner's blade fell, and Catherine Howard's life ended in the glare of the public eye. Her death, swift and precise, was meant to be a cautionary tale, a warning to all who might defy the king or dishonor the crown. And yet, in that moment, she was more than caution. She was the embodiment of youth caught in the merciless grip of ambition, desire, and destiny. Henry VIII mourned briefly, perhaps, and privately, but his grief was tempered by the harsh necessities of kingship. Catherine's life, vibrant and fleeting, had been consumed by forces far larger than love or betrayal. She had been the young bride, the spark, the intoxicating presence that reminded a king of mortality. Desire, and the delicate balance between power and passion. In the annals of history, Catherine Howard remains a tragic figure, a queen whose beauty and youth brought both joy and disaster. She represents the dangers of innocence in a court fueled by intrigue, the fatal consequences of desire, and the relentless, unforgiving nature of Henry VIII's pursuit of legacy. Her story is not one of strategy, not one of careful planning, and not one of survival. It is a story of intensity, of passion, and of doom, a young life extinguished in the furnace of ambition and royal expectation. In the echoing halls of the Tudor court, her laughter, her charm, and her vibrancy were silenced forever, leaving behind a cautionary tale that would reverberate across centuries. Catherine Howard, the young bride, the doomed queen, the spark consumed by fire, remains etched in history not for what she accomplished, but for the brilliant, tragic intensity with which she lived and the profound, irrevocable impact her brief life had on the course of a king's heart and a kingdom's story. Catherine Parr, the scholar who survived the king, in the tumultuous world of Henry VIII's court, where queens rose like comets and fell like meteorites, Catherine Parr entered with the calm of a scholar and the poise of a seasoned diplomat. She was unlike any other of Henry's wives. Where others were celebrated for beauty, youth, or passion, Catherine was celebrated for her intellect, her subtlety, and her extraordinary ability to navigate a court steeped in danger, deceit, and unpredictability. Born into a family of moderate nobility, Catherine Parr was well educated, particularly for a woman of her time. She read Latin and French, was familiar with the classics, and possessed a sharp understanding of theology and politics. This education would serve her well in the perilous halls of the Tudor court, a place where knowledge was as powerful as a sword, and a misplaced word could lead to exile or execution. Catherine had already endured loss and hardship before meeting Henry VIII. Twice widowed, she had survived marriages that were politically advantageous but personally treacherous. These experiences had taught her the delicate balance between survival and influence. By the time Henry cast his gaze upon her, she understood not only the dangers inherent in royal marriage, but also the subtle strategies required to survive and thrive. Her entrance into Henry's life came after decades of observing the chaos that had consumed his previous wives. She knew the history, knew the king's temperament, and yet she accepted the role of queen consort with measured grace. To Henry, who had now aged and suffered the toll of disease, illness, and political turmoil, Catherine offered something rare: companionship, counsel, and a stabilizing presence that neither challenged his authority nor provoked his vanity. From the moment she entered the court as queen, Catherine demonstrated extraordinary skill in balancing loyalty and independence. She did not attempt to outshine Henry in matters of politics or war, nor did she provoke jealousy among courtiers. Instead, she cultivated alliances carefully, speaking in measured tones, listening more than she commanded, and offering advice with tact rather than audacity. Henry, whose previous relationships had been marked by obsession and volatility, found in Catherine a partner who could calm his tempestuous moods. She read to him, discussed religious matters, and engaged in intellectual conversation, an unusual practice for the king, who often surrounded himself with sycophants and flatterers. Her presence brought stability to a court long defined by fear and intrigue. Religion, a matter of life and death in Tudor England, became one of Catherine's arenas of influence. She was deeply Protestant in her sympathies but maintained careful respect for Henry's fluctuating policies. Through her counsel, she helped reconcile tensions between reformist thinkers and the conservative elements of the court. Her role as a mediator and educator in religious matters was unprecedented for a queen consort, and demonstrated her extraordinary intelligence and political acumen. Catherine's relationship with Henry was defined less by passion and more by partnership. While he had once sought wives who could fulfill his desires and produce male heirs, Catherine understood that survival often depended on subtlety and patience. She carefully avoided actions that could provoke the king's jealousy or suspicion, and her tact allowed her to remain in favor where so many others had perished. Her greatest triumph, perhaps, was her ability to maintain her independence while remaining indispensable. She authored books, corresponded with scholars, and influenced matters of education and governance, all while retaining the affection and trust of Henry. Her intellectual pursuits were no mere pastime, they were a means of asserting her identity in a court that had often demanded conformity and silence from women. In addition to her intellectual accomplishments, Catherine played a crucial role as a stepmother to Henry's children. She navigated the complex dynamics of the Tudor family, fostering reconciliation and stability between the king's offspring, including Elizabeth, Mary, and Edward. Her diplomacy ensured that tensions within the royal household were managed, preventing the kind of violent rivalries that had plagued earlier queens. Throughout her tenure as queen, Catherine demonstrated remarkable courage. She survived not only the inherent dangers of Henry's court but also the political pressures of foreign diplomacy, the scrutiny of the church, and the ever-present threat of scandal. Her wisdom in choosing battles and her restraint in moments of tension allowed her to avoid the tragic fates that had befallen Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard, and even Catherine of Aragon. Henry VIII, in his final years, came to rely heavily upon Catherine's counsel. She became more than a wife, she became an advisor, a confidant, and in many ways, the moral compass of a king who had been shaped by ambition, desire, and the relentless pursuit of legacy. Her influence extended beyond domestic affairs, touching on matters of state, diplomacy, and religion. She helped guide the kingdom through a period of uncertainty with remarkable calm and intelligence. Catherine's survival was itself a remarkable achievement. She outlived Henry, navigating a court that had claimed the lives of so many before her. Unlike her predecessors, she did not fall victim to accusations of adultery, treason, or disobedience. Her careful management of both her public and private personas, combined with her sharp intellect, ensured that she remained in favor until Henry's death. Following the king's death in 1547, Catherine's life entered a new chapter. She was free from the constant scrutiny and danger of the court, yet she continued to wield influence through her intellect and charitable works. She remarried, choosing a husband who respected her education, her experience, and her enduring presence in English society. This final marriage, unlike the tumultuous unions with Henry, allowed her to live fully and assert her own identity. Catherine Parr's legacy is profound. She was a queen who survived one of the most dangerous courts in history not through beauty, youth, or ambition, but through intelligence, diplomacy, and moral courage. She shaped the final years of Henry VIII's reign, influenced the education and upbringing of his children, and left a lasting mark on the English monarchy through her wisdom and strength. She is remembered as the only one of Henry VIII's 6 wives to survive him, a remarkable achievement considering the fate of those who came before her. Yet survival was only part of her story. She survived with dignity, influence, and grace, ensuring that her life would be more than a footnote in history, It would be an example of what intellect, patience, and strategic thinking could achieve in a world dominated by power, fear, and desire. Catherine Parr's story is one of resilience, intellect, and quiet triumph. She navigated a court of ambition and betrayal, earned the trust of a king notorious for his ruthlessness, and emerged not only unscathed but respected, revered, and remembered. In a world where queens often became victims of circumstance, Catherine Parr became a symbol of survival, wisdom, and enduring influence. A scholar who tamed a tyrant, nurtured a kingdom, and ultimately outlived the storm that had consumed so many before her. Her contributions extended beyond the court. Catherine was a patron of education, supporting the instruction of women and the publication of theological works. She corresponded with leading scholars of her time, discussing religion, philosophy, and governance, leaving a mark that transcended the ephemeral power of marriage. In these acts, she demonstrated that a queen's influence need not be violent or scandalous. It could be enduring, thoughtful, and transformative. As Henry's final queen, Catherine achieved what no one else had. She survived the king, retained influence over the court, and helped shape the future of the Tudor dynasty. Her life is a testament to the power of intelligence over impulsiveness, diplomacy over passion, and calm over chaos. In surviving Henry VIII, Catherine Parr not only preserved her own life but helped stabilize a kingdom that had endured decades of turmoil, intrigue, and dramatic upheaval. Catherine's legacy lives on through the Tudor children she guided, the intellectual pursuits she championed, and the example she set as a queen who combined scholarship with strategy. Her life reminds us that true power is not always visible in the glitter of a crown or the sharpness of a sword. Sometimes, it is found in the quiet confidence of a woman who understands the world, reads it carefully, and moves within it with grace, intelligence, and patience. Even today, Catherine Parr is remembered as a queen who survived, not by yielding to desire or ambition alone, but by understanding the king, the court, and herself. She was a scholar, a mediator, a survivor, and a woman who turned the perilous tides of the Tudor court into an enduring legacy of wisdom and influence. Catherine Parr, the last wife, the scholar, the queen who survived the storm of Henry VIII, stands as a testament to intelligence, diplomacy, and courage. Her life illustrates that survival, when combined with intellect and tact, can achieve more than passion, rebellion, or beauty ever could. In a court defined by intrigue, desire, and deadly ambition, Catherine Parr not only survived, she thrived, and she did so with dignity, grace, and the quiet authority of a true scholar queen. Royal politics and European chess. The power behind Henry VIII's marriages. In the grand tapestry of 16th century Europe, kings and queens were far more than symbols of pageantry. They were living chess pieces, pawns and rooks in a game of alliances, power, and survival. Henry VIII, perhaps the most famous English monarch, lived in a world where marriages were not only personal unions but instruments of diplomacy, weapons of statecraft, and mirrors of ambition. To understand the saga of his 6 wives, one must first peer into the intricate web of European politics, where every crown, every kingdom, and every courtly whisper had consequences far beyond the palace walls. By the time Henry ascended the throne in 1509, Europe was a continent divided by ambition, religion, and dynastic rivalry. Spain and France were at odds, each seeking dominance over Italy and influence in the New World. The Holy Roman Empire, sprawling and fragmented, moved like a living entity of principalities, dukes, and electors. The English crown, though comparatively small in size, played a disproportionately influential role in this intricate network. Henry VIII's family, the Tudors, understood the fragility of their position. England was powerful enough to be courted, but vulnerable enough to be ignored or invaded. Every marriage would need to serve a purpose, securing alliances, consolidating power, and fortifying the Tudor claim to the throne. Henry's father, Henry VII, had secured the Tudor dynasty through his own political marriage to Elizabeth of York, ending decades of civil war known as the Wars of the Roses. That legacy of dynastic strategy became the backdrop against which Henry VIII would choose his brides. Each wife, beyond her beauty, charm, or youth, represented a move in the grand game of international diplomacy. The stakes were high. A royal marriage could either cement alliances or provoke wars. Every union had the potential to change the fate of kingdoms. The first wife, Catherine of Aragon, exemplifies the marriage of politics and personal life. Catherine was a Spanish princess, daughter of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, the monarchs who had unified Spain and sponsored Christopher Columbus's voyages. Her marriage to Henry was never about love, it was about political consolidation. By marrying Catherine, England secured a bond with Spain, one of the continent's most powerful and ambitious nations. This alliance promised protection, trade advantages, and the subtle yet profound prestige of being linked to one of Europe's most illustrious royal families. Spanish influence permeated the English court through Catherine, introducing stricter Catholic orthodoxy and reinforcing the legitimacy of Tudor rule. Her union was a signal to France and the Holy Roman Empire that England had powerful allies. Catherine's marriage, however, was not merely a domestic matter, it was a diplomatic statement writ large. The Spanish crown deployed ambassadors to London, ensuring that the marriage ceremony, the etiquette of court, and even the public presentation of the bride reinforced Spain's grandeur. Every gift, every jewel, every banner was a declaration of power and wealth. The English court became a stage for international politics, where the king's personal life intersected seamlessly with the strategic ambitions of two nations. The second wife, Anne Boleyn, introduced another layer to Henry's diplomatic chessboard. Anne's rise was deeply entwined with the shifting religious landscape of Europe. England, under Catherine, remained staunchly Catholic, aligned with Rome. Anne's Protestant sympathies, though subtle at first, symbolized a growing faction in England eager for religious reform. Her marriage forced Henry to sever ties with the Catholic Church, creating the Church of England and asserting independence from papal authority. This act had enormous political ramifications. England's break with Rome not only redefined religion but recalibrated its alliances, making it a counterweight to both Spain and France and aligning the kingdom with emerging Protestant powers in Northern Europe. Anne's influence demonstrates how marriages were not just personal matters but strategic tools for reshaping power structures. Diplomats from France, the Holy Roman Empire, and Spain watched the Tudor court with keen interest, knowing that every decision, every coronation, annulment, or birth, had repercussions across Europe. In this era, a queen's influence was inseparable from the politics she carried, whether through her family ties, her religious stance, or her ability to sway the king. Jane Seymour, the third wife, provided a different form of political advantage. While her marriage was less about foreign diplomacy than domestic stability, it served Henry's dynastic ambitions. Jane bore the much-desired male heir, Edward, ensuring the Tudor lineage would continue without dispute. Dynastic continuity was itself a political tool. A secure heir reduced the likelihood of civil war, strengthened England's bargaining position with continental powers, and allowed Henry to negotiate from a position of confidence. In Europe, stability in England meant fewer opportunities for rival nations to exploit succession crises. The fourth wife, Anne of Cleves, was chosen entirely for her political value. The marriage was orchestrated by Henry's council to strengthen ties with German Protestant states against France and the Holy Roman Empire. Anne herself was politically aware and schooled in the subtle arts of diplomacy, but her primary role was as a living alliance. Portraits were commissioned to appease the king, ambassadors negotiated dowries and territories, and every detail, from her journey to England to the coronation plan, was meticulously orchestrated to solidify continental relations. Even though Henry found her personally unattractive and the marriage ended quickly, the alliance itself survived, and Anne retained a place in England as a politically useful figure, demonstrating how diplomacy often outweighed personal preference. The fifth wife, Catherine Howard, illustrates the intersection of personal desire and political consequence. Though young and inexperienced, her marriage had diplomatic implications because she was a member of the powerful Howard family, one of England's most influential noble houses. Her elevation to queen strengthened the Howards' position at court, signaling to domestic factions that Henry was allied with a major internal power bloc. Yet Catherine's personal indiscretions destabilized this political calculus, showing how courtly intrigue and private behavior could derail carefully constructed alliances. Her execution was as much a political act as a personal one, demonstrating the king's control and preserving the delicate balance of power within England's nobility. Finally, Catherine Parr, the sixth wife, represents diplomacy as survival and subtle influence. By the time she married Henry, he was older, ill, and politically experienced. Catherine's intelligence and tact allowed her to manage not only the king's temperament, but also the factions within the court and the wider European political landscape. She acted as a mediator between the king and his children, oversaw religious reform within England, and maintained crucial alliances with European powers. Her survival as queen until Henry's death was itself a triumph of political acumen, showing that diplomacy, intellect, and discretion could secure influence as effectively as marriage alliances or royal births. Throughout these 6 marriages, foreign ambassadors constantly monitored England. Spain, France, Germany, and the Holy Roman Empire all sought leverage, whether through the king's personal life, succession, or religion. Marriages were contracts, yes, but they were also strategic signals. Each wife was more than a partner, she was a conduit for international negotiation, a reflection of dynastic ambition, and a living instrument of statecraft. Gifts, banquets, letters, and ceremonies were carefully staged to communicate power and intent, both to domestic audiences and to the continental courts. The political chess of Henry VIII's marriages shows that in Tudor England, personal choice rarely mattered. Beauty, charm, and personality were secondary to lineage, alliances, and religious positioning. Queens were queens because they served a greater purpose: diplomacy, succession, and stability. Ambassadors recorded every nuance of court life, every marital dispute, and every coronation detail, sending back intelligence that would shape treaties, trade, and wars. In this sense, the life of Henry VIII's wives was inseparable from the fate of nations. Ultimately, the story of Henry's 6 marriages is also a story of European politics in motion. Each union reflects the delicate balance of power, the interplay of personal desire and public necessity, and the high stakes of dynastic ambition. Henry VIII may be remembered for his egos, desires, and violent impulses, but behind every crown, coronation, and scandal was the relentless influence of diplomacy, politics, and international strategy, a reminder that in the Tudor era, love and power were rarely separate, and every queen was both a consort and a strategic instrument of the realm. The personal lives and characters of Henry VIII's wives, a court of beauty, brilliance, and intrigue, in the glittering yet perilous world of the Tudor court, where loyalty was fleeting and betrayal lurked behind every velvet curtain, the 6 wives of Henry VIII were more than queens. They were personalities molded by childhood, education, circumstance, and the endless expectations of power. To understand the grandeur, tragedy, and influence of these women, one must peer beyond their coronation robes and jewels, into the personal histories and temperaments that shaped their decisions and defined their fates. From the very beginning, Catherine of Aragon carried the weight of royal duty with grace. Born in 1485, she was the youngest daughter of Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile, monarchs who had unified Spain and sponsored the voyages that would alter the world forever. Catherine's upbringing was steeped in piety, ceremony, and the rigid expectations of a dynastic princess. Education was paramount. She was fluent in Latin and Spanish, versed in theology, history, and diplomacy. From her earliest days, Catherine was taught to embody the ideal of a queen, obedient, learned, and morally upright. Her personal character reflected this upbringing: disciplined, devout, and unwaveringly loyal. She carried herself with dignity, projecting an air of calm confidence even in the stormy and often cruel environment of the Tudor court. Yet this composure masked an inner resilience. Catherine endured the loss of children, political exile, and Henry's eventual rejection, all while maintaining the poise expected of a queen of Spain and England alike. By contrast, Anne Boleyn emerged from a family steeped in English nobility but defined by ambition. Anne's early years were spent in the courts of the Netherlands and France, where she absorbed the subtleties of courtly behavior, French manners, and Renaissance culture. She was witty, intelligent, and possessed a magnetic charm that could captivate both princes and courtiers. Anne's education included music, literature, and languages, giving her a worldly sophistication that distinguished her from many contemporaries. Her character was bold and inquisitive, marked by a cunning that would both elevate her to the pinnacle of power and ultimately lead to her downfall. The court was a chessboard, and Anne knew precisely how to move her pieces. A tilt of the head, a whispered word, a carefully timed smile could manipulate allies, unsettle rivals, and even sway the king himself. Anne's personality was a study in contrast, alluring yet unpredictable, charming yet politically calculated. Embodying both the Renaissance ideal of femininity and the dangerous edge of ambition. Jane Seymour, in her youth, was markedly different. Born to a family of minor gentry, she was quiet, modest, and understated. Her upbringing emphasized obedience, domestic skill, and the virtues of humility. Jane was well educated by the standards of her family's social standing, with training in reading, writing, music, and religion, but she was not a flamboyant intellectual like Anne Boleyn or Catherine Parr. Instead, her beauty lay in her serenity and gentleness, traits that reflected a character shaped by patience, compassion, and moral fortitude. Jane's demeanor attracted Henry not through boldness but through quiet grace. She was the balm to his tempestuous nature, embodying the ideal of a submissive yet loving consort. Her personal character allowed her to navigate court intrigue subtly, never challenging the king openly yet exerting influence in understated ways that would secure her place in history as the mother of Edward VI. Anne of Cleves presents yet another dimension of personal life intersecting with political necessity. Born into German nobility, Anne was educated in the sophisticated, humanist traditions of the Rhineland. She was literate, articulate, and conversant in multiple languages. Her upbringing emphasized decorum, intelligence, and diplomacy, a preparation for life in courts far from her homeland. Anne's personal character was adaptable. She knew the importance of maintaining dignity in unfamiliar and potentially hostile environments. Yet, despite her polished education and poise, she faced challenges when confronted with the unpredictability of Henry VIII's personal desires. Her personality, grounded in rationality and grace, allowed her to survive the breakdown of her marriage and transform a political misstep into a role of continued influence as the king's beloved sister. Anne's character illustrates how education, temperament, and personal judgment could be as crucial as beauty in navigating the treacherous waters of the Tudor court. Catherine Howard, by contrast, embodies the risks of youth and inexperience in such a high-stakes environment. Born into the powerful Howard family, Catherine's early life was marked by both privilege and exposure to courtly intrigue. She was educated in the arts, music, and social etiquette, but her upbringing lacked the rigid structure and moral guidance that had shaped Catherine of Aragon or Jane Seymour. Catherine's personal character was impulsive, passionate, and, at times, reckless. She was charming, vivacious, and flirtatious, traits that won her Henry's affection but also contributed to her eventual downfall. In the intricate and often dangerous environment of the Tudor court, Catherine's youth and vivacity collided with the unforgiving expectations of a king accustomed to obedience and political calculation. Her story demonstrates how temperament and personal choices could have life or death consequences within a court defined by surveillance, suspicion, and political ambition. Finally, Catherine Parr stands as a testament to intellect, adaptability, and wisdom cultivated through experience. Born to a family of minor nobility, Catherine received an exceptional education for a woman of her era, including literature, languages, and theology. Her personal character was marked by prudence, tact, and emotional intelligence. She understood the subtle dynamics of court life and used her intellect to navigate the complexities of Henry's personality, his volatile court, and the political pressures of England and Europe. Catherine's life before marriage had already been shaped by loss, widowhood, and political calculation, giving her a profound understanding of human behavior and strategy. As Henry's final wife, she combined scholarship with diplomacy, guiding the king, managing court factions, and exerting influence without overstepping the dangerous boundaries that had claimed her predecessors. Catherine Parr's personality reflects an extraordinary balance of courage, intellect, and strategic patience, a queen who survived where others had perished not merely because of luck, but because of her understanding of human nature, politics, and the subtleties of character. Across these 6 women, certain patterns emerge: education and upbringing, temperament, and the ability to read and respond to courtly intrigue were as decisive as beauty or royal blood. Each queen's personal character shaped not only her relationship with Henry VIII but also her influence in England and abroad. Catherine of Aragon's unwavering piety, and Boleyn's charisma and cunning, Jane Seymour's serenity, and of Clevy's adaptability, Catherine Howard's youthful vivacity, and Catherine Parr's wisdom and diplomacy. All these traits reveal the complex human dimension behind historical events often reduced to scandal, marriage, and execution. Court intrigue profoundly affected every personal decision these women made. Friendships, rivalries, and the endless whisperings of courtiers influenced their choices in dress, speech, and behavior. A single remark could make or break a queen's favor. A minor misstep could become a political liability. In navigating such a world, each wife brought her own unique combination of intellect, charm, and courage. The personal lives of Henry VIII's wives were inseparable from the pressures of politics, succession, and religion, creating a rich tapestry where character and circumstance were inextricably linked. In examining their personal histories, one sees more than just victims of a tyrannical king. One sees women of remarkable strength, intelligence, and complexity, each navigating the most perilous court in Europe with varying degrees of success. Their lives illuminate the delicate balance between individuality and duty, desire and discretion, ambition and survival, a balance that would define the Tudor court and ultimately shape the course of English history. The personal lives and characters of Henry VIII's wives remind us that behind the grandeur of crowns and coronations lay deeply human stories of courage, intellect, charm, folly, and endurance. Their personalities dictated how they responded to power, temptation, and danger. They were not merely ornaments of the court. They were active participants in the drama of their age, each leaving an indelible mark on history that extends far beyond their appearances or marriages. Marriages of Henry VIII, passion, power, and the courtly stage, in the grand halls of Hampton Court and the echoing corridors of Whitehall. The story of Henry VIII's marriages unfolds like a relentless opera, each act filled with passion, politics, and peril. To understand the extraordinary lives of his 6 wives, one must immerse in the details of their unions: the first glance, the royal ceremony, the tensions behind closed doors, and the dramatic consequences that rippled across England and beyond. In the Tudor court, marriage was never just a private affair, it was a stage on which power, diplomacy, and desire performed their intricate dance. The curtain rises with Catherine of Aragon, the Spanish princess whose union with Henry was forged from diplomacy more than passion. At 17, Henry married Catherine, the widow of his older brother Arthur, as the culmination of international negotiations that bound England to Spain. Their wedding, adorned with gold embroidery, music, and processionals, was a spectacle designed to impress not only the English nobility but European powers who watched every movement with calculated interest. The couple initially shared mutual respect and affection. Henry admired Catherine's intelligence, grace, and devoutness, while Catherine, educated in the refined courts of Spain, adapted gracefully to the formalities and intrigue of the English palace. Yet the marriage, though politically advantageous, faced immense personal pressure. Catherine bore numerous children, yet only one, Mary, survived infancy. England, a kingdom obsessed with male heirs and dynastic continuity, cast a shadow of disappointment over their union. Henry, whose fiery temperament was intertwined with royal expectation, began to seek alternatives, setting the stage for political and personal upheaval that would define the next chapters of his marital saga. Enter Anne Boleyn, whose courtly charm and intellectual sophistication transformed the Tudor court. Anne's courtship with Henry was no ordinary romance, it was a calculated performance. She held the king spellbound, employing wit, coyness, and a refined understanding of courtly politics to manipulate the labyrinthine rules of Tudor etiquette. Their marriage, formalized after Henry's controversial break with the Catholic Church, redefined England's religious and political landscape, and gave birth to Elizabeth, whose presence would eventually cement her own indelible legacy. Yet the absence of a male heir fueled Henry's dissatisfaction. Tensions escalated as suspicions, rumors, and courtly intrigue surrounded Anne. She faced accusations of adultery, treason, and witchcraft, leading to her execution. The spectacle of her trial and subsequent death illustrated the lethal stakes of Tudor marital politics, where personal affection collided violently with dynastic obsession. The third act features Jane Seymour, whose serene demeanor and understated beauty offered Henry a respite from the turbulence of previous marriages. Jane's courtship was less a battle of wits than a quiet seduction of patience, virtue, and strategic compliance. She became queen shortly after Anne Boleyn's death, her coronation a subdued contrast to the flamboyance of Anne's reign. Jane's greatest gift to Henry was Edward, his long-desired male heir. The birth solidified her position, yet tragically, she died shortly thereafter, leaving the king bereft and introducing another period of mourning and reflection. Jane's marriage represents a fleeting harmony, where devotion and duty briefly aligned before the inevitable shadow of mortality intervened. The fourth wife, Anne of Cleves, entered the scene as a diplomatic instrument, a living alliance between England and the Protestant German states. Henry's court had orchestrated the marriage meticulously, expecting a union of power rather than peace. Yet when Anne arrived, personal chemistry faltered. Henry reportedly declared he likes her not. Their marriage endured only a few months before a legal annulment dissolved the union. Despite the brevity, the arrangement reflected the fusion of personal desire and political necessity, demonstrating the complex negotiations, dowries, and ceremonial obligations entwined with each royal marriage. And retained dignity and influence as the king's beloved sister, a rare survivor of Tudor marital vicissitudes, illustrating the delicate balance between personal incompatibility and political advantage. Next, Catherine Howard entered the royal stage as a symbol of youthful vitality and dangerous allure. Her marriage to Henry was marked by passion, scandal, and intrigue. Catherine, young and inexperienced, captivated the aging king, yet her previous romantic indiscretions became weaponized by court factions. The ensuing accusations, trial, and execution revealed the Tudor court as a crucible of personal ambition, social scrutiny, and lethal politics. Catherine's story demonstrates how courtly alliances, family influence, and private indiscretions intersected with the public duties of queenship, making each misstep potentially fatal. Finally, Catherine Parr, Henry's sixth wife, represents the consummation of political and personal acumen. Catherine entered the marriage as a widow of notable experience. Educated, politically savvy, and capable of managing Henry's temper and court factions with finesse. Her union emphasized strategy over romance, ensuring the king's legacy, promoting religious reform, and preserving her own safety. Catherine navigated ceremonial duties, counsel, and the care of Henry's children with grace, surviving where her predecessors had perished. Her marriage illustrates the interplay of diplomacy, intellect, and emotional intelligence, proving that in Henry's court, survival often depended as much on character as on beauty or obedience. Throughout these unions, court intrigue permeated every aspect of marital life. The queen's daily routine, from her dressing, audience with courtiers, to ceremonial appearances, was influenced by political factions, foreign ambassadors, and the king's ever-shifting moods. Gifts, jewels, and letters were more than tokens of affection. They were instruments of influence, surveillance, and negotiation. Queens had to navigate etiquette, alliances, and expectations with precision, for a single misstep could provoke scandal or even death. Each marriage also carried profound dynastic implications. The birth of heirs, or lack thereof, dictated succession, political alliances, and the stability of the realm. Sons, daughters, and miscarriages were not private tragedies alone but matters of state concern. Ambassadors across Europe observed each development, reporting back to their sovereigns, whose responses could alter treaties, incite conflicts, or shift power balances. Furthermore, ceremonial life, coronations, banquets, justs, and courtly entertainments serve dual purposes, reinforcing the queen's personal stature and projecting political might to domestic and foreign audiences. The pageantry of each marriage communicated messages of continuity, legitimacy, and strength, while the subtler rituals of court revealed the nuanced interplay between personal influence and political strategy. In the lives of Henry VIII's wives, one sees the fusion of human desire with statecraft, love with duty, beauty with intellect. Their marriages were stages where romance and politics performed a perpetual dance, where private affection collided with public obligation, and where each decision reverberated across the kingdom and beyond. The marital journey of Henry VIII, from Catherine of Aragon's steadfast devotion and Boleyn's dazzling ambition, Jane Seymour's serene grace, and of Clevy's diplomatic presence, Catherine Howard's youthful allure, to Catherine Parr's strategic intelligence, reveals the human dimension behind history. It underscores that these unions were not merely personal chapters but instruments of diplomacy, power, and survival, interwoven into the political and cultural fabric of Tudor England. Heirs, succession, and the fragile stability of Henry VIII England, in the Tudor court, nothing was more sacred, or more dangerous, than the question of succession. For Henry VIII, the birth of a male heir was not a mere wish, it was an obsession that dictated alliances, marriages, and the very fate of England itself. Every heartbeat in the nursery, every sigh in the Queen's chamber, every whisper among the courtiers carried monumental weight. A child's arrival could solidify the dynasty, while the absence of one could unravel centuries of careful political strategy. From the moment Henry ascended the throne in 1509, the pressure of securing England's future pressed upon him. His father, Henry VII, had established the Tudor dynasty only after decades of civil war, uniting the warring houses of Lancaster and York. The legacy was fragile. The king understood that a secure line of succession would prevent England from spiraling back into chaos. Sons were essential, daughters tolerated but insufficient to cement dynastic claims. In this high-stakes environment, every queen's fertility was scrutinized, every pregnancy monitored, and every child's survival celebrated, or mourned with anxiety. The first chapter in this saga begins with Catherine of Aragon. Catherine bore the weight of national expectation with extraordinary resilience. Over 2 decades of marriage, she endured numerous pregnancies, yet only one child, Mary, survived infancy. For Catherine, each miscarriage was both personal heartbreak and political catastrophe. For Henry, each loss heightened the urgency for a male heir. His devotion to Catherine gradually gave way to frustration, as dynastic necessity collided with human limitation. Political advisors whispered, religious leaders intervened, and the court buzzed with speculation. Catherine's situation was a cruel reflection of the era. A queen's worth was often measured in children, particularly sons, and her failure to provide a male heir rendered her vulnerable to replacement. Then came Anne Boleyn, whose very presence intensified the dynastic crisis. Her courtship with Henry coincided with his growing obsession with a male successor. Anne's pregnancy initially promised hope. When she gave birth to Elizabeth, the disappointment was palpable. Though Elizabeth would one day become one of England's greatest monarchs, in the nursery of Tudor politics, she was a reminder of the king's continuing anxiety. Anne's inability to produce a son destabilized her position, and the intersection of succession and ambition fueled court intrigue that ultimately led to her downfall. Accusations of adultery and treason were leveled against her, demonstrating how intimately succession was tied to life and death in the Tudor court. Jane Seymour entered the scene with a calm, stabilizing influence. She bore Henry his long-awaited male heir, Edward, in 1537. The court erupted in celebration. The birth of a son represented the fulfillment of dynastic prophecy. Jane's position as queen was strengthened immeasurably by this event. Yet her triumph was fleeting. She died shortly after childbirth. Henry's grief was profound. For the birth of Edward validated both his reign and the Tudor claim, even as Jane's death reminded him of the fragility of life and the unpredictable consequences of childbirth. and of Cleves, though married for a brief period, played a different role in the succession narrative. While she did not bear children, her marriage was politically orchestrated to secure alliances and maintain stability in Protestant Europe. The union's failure in personal terms did not destabilize the dynasty, as the male heir Edward had already been born. Nevertheless, Anne's presence highlighted the importance of queenship in securing the king's authority and projecting dynastic legitimacy abroad. Catherine Howard, young and beautiful, brought renewed hope and danger to the succession equation. Though she was unable to provide children, her union with Henry reflected the ongoing search for dynastic security and political satisfaction. Her past indiscretions, discovered by courtly rivals, jeopardized not only her position but also the perceived stability of the court. In the Tudor system, a queen's moral reputation was inseparable from her ability to secure the line of succession. Catherine's downfall underscored the lethal consequences of failing to align personal conduct with dynastic expectation. Finally, Catherine Parr, the king's sixth wife, played a stabilizing role in the twilight of Henry's life. She did not bear children to the king, but she ensured the survival of his heirs through careful management of the royal children, Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward. Catherine's intellect, patience, and diplomatic skill contributed to a stable succession, preventing civil unrest and consolidating Tudor authority. By fostering education, religious instruction, and political awareness in Henry's children, Catherine Parr secured the dynasty's future in ways that transcended mere childbirth. The intense focus on heirs in Henry VIII court was mirrored in every aspect of courtly life. Pregnancies were announced with fanfare, the birth of sons was celebrated with festivals, coins, and public proclamations. Miscarriages or stillbirths prompted mourning, reflection, and occasionally political maneuvering. Courtiers positioned themselves to influence or capitalize on the king's changing affections, advisors leveraged events to advance their agendas, and foreign diplomats reported every development to their sovereigns. The Tudor nursery, though intimate, was also a stage where the future of England itself was negotiated. The stakes of succession extended beyond personal happiness or dynastic ambition. A male heir promised continuity, strengthened alliances, and ensured that England could assert its influence in Europe with confidence. Without such heirs, the kingdom risked uncertainty, factional rivalry, or even foreign intervention. Each queen's reproductive success, or failure, was therefore both intensely personal and profoundly political. Henry's obsession with heirs was not mere vanity, it was inseparable from the existential security of the Tudor dynasty. Throughout these marital and reproductive dramas, religion and law intertwined with succession. Papal dispensations, annulments, and acts of parliament were all employed to secure legitimate heirs. Henry's break with Rome, his creation of the Church of England, and his manipulation of religious authority were intimately tied to his desire for a male heir. Succession, politics, and personal desire were inextricably linked, creating a court where every decision, every pregnancy, and every birth resonated with both domestic and international consequences. The children themselves, Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward, became focal points of political calculation from birth. Their legitimacy, upbringing, and education were managed with painstaking attention. Tutors, governors, and the surviving queens ensured that these heirs were prepared to rule, aware of their responsibilities, and capable of navigating the treacherous waters of English and European politics. Each child's survival and development were thus not only personal triumphs but strategic imperatives for the dynasty's survival. In the world of Henry VIII, succession was both a promise and a peril. Every queen's ability to bear a son, every child's survival, and every courtly maneuver were interwoven into the fabric of England's stability. The king's obsession, the queen's resilience, and the delicate balance of politics created a tapestry in which personal lives, dynastic ambition, and national security were inseparable. The Tudor monarchy was as much about human relationships as it was about power, and in the realm of heirs and succession, Henry VIII court remains one of history's most dramatic, consequential, and humanly compelling stages. Court intrigue and personal dynamics, the wives of Henry VIII in the theater of power, in the glittering, treacherous corridors of the Tudor court, every glance, whisper, and gesture held consequences as potent as any battlefield. Henry VIII's marriages were more than unions of love or obligation, they were a complex interplay of personalities, alliances, rivalries, and survival. To understand the lives of his 6 wives, one must see them not merely as queens but as actors on a stage where power and peril danced hand in hand, where allies could turn into enemies in a heartbeat, and where the king's favor was both a blessing and a death sentence. The drama begins with Catherine of Aragon, whose steadfastness in devotion and piety became both her strength and her vulnerability. Her alliances were primarily with the Spanish court and the faction of English nobles loyal to tradition and Catholic orthodoxy. Within the English court, Catherine relied on trusted advisors and servants who navigated the intricate labyrinth of Henry's favor, balancing diplomacy, family loyalty, and survival. Yet court intrigue did not spare even a queen of her stature. Rival factions, particularly those aligned with Anne Boleyn and the king's reformist allies, plotted to undermine her influence, exploiting her failure to produce a male heir. Catherine's personal integrity and moral fortitude became weapons and shields simultaneously, as she resisted pressure to accept annulment and maintained her claim to queenhood, demonstrating how personal character and political acumen could intertwine in the Tudor theater of power. And Boleyn enters the court with a dynamism that electrified the atmosphere. She was at once a participant and manipulator of court intrigue, aware that every compliment, whispered secret, and strategic pause could advance her standing. Anne's supporters included reformist clergy, ambitious courtiers, and members of her own family, who recognized the opportunity to elevate their status through her rising influence. Yet Anne's enemies were equally formidable. Conservative nobles, loyalists to Catherine of Aragon, and those threatened by her intelligence and charm constantly worked to diminish her sway. Anne's marriage to Henry not only broke religious tradition but also created factions that would ultimately decide her fate. Her ability to navigate, though ultimately not survive, the shifting allegiances of the court illustrates the razor-thin line between power and peril, between influence and execution. Jane Seymour presented a different dynamic. She was quiet, unassuming, and less embroiled in overt factional battles than her predecessors. Yet even in her serenity, alliances were crucial. Her family, loyal to the king, worked tirelessly to secure her favor, positioning Jane as the calm, stabilizing presence Henry desired. Courtiers aligned with Jane benefited from her influence, while rivals recognized that her access to the king and her potential to produce a male heir could shift the balance of power. Jane's marriage demonstrates that even subtlety and quiet intelligence could become powerful tools in the strategic negotiations of court life. Her relationships were defined by restraint, diplomacy, and timing, proving that influence could be wielded without overt confrontation, though always under the shadow of the king's expectations. Finally, Catherine Parr's approach to court intrigue was marked by strategy, intellect, and patience. Having experienced widowhood and political navigation before her marriage to Henry, Catherine understood the intricate web of alliances and enmities that defined Tudor politics. She cultivated relationships with key advisors, nobles, and the king's children, ensuring that she maintained influence while avoiding the pitfalls that had claimed her predecessors. Catherine Parr's marriage demonstrates that survival in the court required not only charm and intelligence but the ability to read shifting loyalties, anticipate threats, and act with measured diplomacy. Her alliances were both social and political, carefully constructed to consolidate her position, manage the king's temper, and support the Tudor dynasty. Across all 6 wives, the patterns of courtly intrigue reveal a world where personal and political lives were inseparable. Friendships, rivalries, and whispered conspiracies shaped every decision, from how to address the king, to what to wear, to how to manage household and courtly duties. Every queen had allies, family members, foreign envoys, sympathetic courtiers, and every queen faced enemies, both open and covert. The shifting dynamics of support and opposition demanded constant vigilance, emotional intelligence, and strategic acumen. Misjudgment could be fatal, but skillful navigation could ensure influence, legacy, or even survival. The Tudor court's intrigue was further intensified by the interplay of religion, succession, and diplomacy. Decisions made in private chambers often carried public consequences, supporting a religious reformer, opposing a particular noble faction, or influencing Henry's perception could alter England's domestic and international policies. A queen's ability to manage these dynamics affected not only her personal safety but the stability of the kingdom, the succession of heirs, and the reputation of the Tudor dynasty. Court intrigue was therefore both personal theater and national strategy, where every gesture mattered, and every choice could reverberate for decades. The wives of Henry VIII were not passive spectators in this drama. They acted, reacted, and maneuvered within the ever-shifting landscape of power. Their personal qualities, diplomacy, wit, charm, intelligence, morality, and sometimes youthful impulsiveness, interacted with external pressures to create outcomes both triumphant and tragic. The alliances they forged, the enemies they faced, and the strategies they employed offer a vivid portrait of how human agency, personality, and circumstance intersected with history. Through the lens of court intrigue and personal dynamics, the lives of Henry VIII's wives transform from mere footnotes of scandal and succession into a complex tapestry of courage, strategy, intellect, and vulnerability. Their stories reveal that behind the gold, velvet, and coronations lay a world governed by perception, influence, and the mercurial will of a king whose favor could both elevate and annihilate. The interplay of alliances, rivalries, and courtly maneuvering shaped not only the queens themselves but the very destiny of Tudor England. Each marriage, each personal relationship, and each political maneuver was a thread in the intricate web of power, demonstrating that survival, influence, and legacy were never merely about beauty, piety, or obedience, but about navigating the treacherous and mesmerizing stage of one of history's most dramatic courts. Henry VIII, power, rule, and the cold machinery of punishment. In the early mornings of Tudor England, when fog still clung to the River Thames like a shroud, the kingdom belonged entirely to one man. Henry VIII, broad-shouldered, flame-haired, restless with ambition, stood at his palace windows with the gaze of someone who believed England itself breathed because he willed it so. To the world, he was not just a king. He was destiny wearing a crown. And he ruled exactly like that. From the moment he ascended the throne, Henry treated kingship as both a performance and a battlefield. He loved the splendor of it, the silk banners, the jeweled courtiers, the echoing choirs of Westminster, but beneath the glitter beat a heart hungry for control. He believed a king must be loved, yes, but feared just a little more. The court, a theater of loyalty and suspicion, Henry's court glittered like a jewel box. Foreign ambassadors whispered of its magnificence, the polished floors, the gold-threaded tapestries, the roar of feasts that lasted until the moon bowed and left. But behind all the music and wine lay something colder. Every nobleman knew the truth. Every lady-in-waiting sensed it in her bones. To rise in Henry's court was to dance on a blade. Henry could raise a man from poverty to power with one afternoon's favor, and he could send that same man to the scaffold by morning. Small gestures became currency, a bow too low, a sentence too bold, a compliment phrased incorrectly, any of it could mean ruin. And Henry noticed everything. His blue eyes, often soft with charm, could harden into something unforgiving without warning. Ambassadors wrote home that standing before him felt like facing a lion dressed in velvet. Royal governance, a kingdom shaped by desire and fear, Henry VIII governed with a blend of intelligence, impulse, and theatrical force. One day he expanded England's navy with visionary ambition, the next he shattered centuries of religious unity because his heart demanded a new marriage. He surrounded himself with advisors, Wolsey, Cromwell, Cranmer, men brilliant enough to understand his moods, and terrified enough to obey them. Policies were built, reshaped, or burned to ash depending on Henry's desires. England's laws shifted like weather because the king himself was the storm. His governance had a rhythm, glory, when the king was pleased, terror, when the king was not. And the entire nation waited to see which side of him would rise each morning. The machinery of punishment, cold, public, and absolute, Henry VIII's justice was not subtle. It was a spectacle. Crimes, treason, heresy, adultery, even suspected disloyalty, were not handled quietly behind palace doors. They were displayed like warnings across London, sharpened into stories told beside hearths, whispered to children, etched into memory. The Tower of London, the King's iron echo, anyone summoned to the tower knew that daylight might be their last. The stone walls held screams, secrets, and the final breaths of those who once dared to stand too close to power. Within its chambers, interrogators didn't need to shout. The silence did the work. Some prisoners faced questioning, soft at first, then tightening like rope. Others were shown instruments that needed no introduction, and some were given no questions at all, only a date. Henry didn't always watch the punishments, but he allowed them. He needed them. A king's authority, he believed, must feel like thunder even from a distance. Public executions, power made visible, execution days turned London into a trembling sea of faces. Men climbed rooftops, women held their children tight, and the air carried a strange mix of fear and excitement. Whether by hanging, burning, or the sharp, clean stroke of the axe, every punishment was a message: the king's will is law. His anger is death. Even nobles were not spared. A queen could rise from obscurity to royalty, and fall from royalty to the scaffold in a heartbeat. People whispered Henry's name with a blend of awe and dread. Was he cruel? Was he just? Was he a man or a force of nature? No one could say, and that uncertainty was exactly how he maintained his power. A kingdom living under a shifting sky. Under Henry, England felt alive, unpredictable, watchful. Nights were filled with songs about the king's victories, but also with murmured prayers for protection. Court musicians sang of his charm, while common people spoke of his temper in quiet tavern corners. And yet, for all the danger, all the executions, all the fear, England also felt proud. Henry's presence cast a long shadow, but it also cast a brilliant light. He turned the country outward toward Europe, built ships that made the seas tremble, and left a mark so deep that even centuries later, his reign feels like a roaring fire in the dark. For better or worse, every heartbeat of Tudor England followed the rhythm of one man, a king who loved glory, demanded loyalty, and ruled a nation with the same fierce intensity with which he lived. The shadow courts, spies, secrets, and the invisible throne of Henry VIII. As the sun dipped behind the jagged rooftops of Tudor London, the city changed its shape. Daytime England belonged to merchants, sailors, and the clatter of horse hooves on stone. But nighttime England? That belonged to the king's shadows, spies, informants, whisper collectors whose names never appeared in records, but whose footsteps shaped the fate of nations. Henry VIII ruled not only with swords and laws, but with ears. Ears hidden in the palaces. Ears in taverns thick with ale-scented gossip. Ears even in the private chambers of the nobility. Every word spoken in England felt as if it might find its way to the king. Cromwell's web, a kingdom watched by invisible eyes. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's most efficient architect of power, built a spy network that felt more like a living creature than a political system. Courtiers often joked, quietly, that walls had mouths and rafters had memory. No conversation felt safe. Not even whispers. A servant girl wiping a table might secretly work for Cromwell. A guard at the palace gate might quietly report to the archbishop. A musician in the royal hall might pluck his lute by night and gather secrets by dawn. And once a secret reached Cromwell, it flowed straight into the king's veins like fire. Henry didn't need to search for disloyalty. It came to him, wrapped in parchment, sealed with wax, and delivered by trembling hands. The king's chamber, where smile and sentence looked the same, to stand before Henry was to stand inside a storm disguised as a man. His face could beam with charm, with warmth, with a kingly affection that made courtiers feel chosen. But his eyes, those sharp, assessing eyes, they missed nothing. A brief hesitation before answering, a flicker of discomfort in the jaw. A glance exchanged between two men. These were not gestures to King Henry. These were signals. A warning flare. A possible crack in loyalty. Advisors who sensed danger often tried to switch the king's attention, offering new strategies, new plots, new enemies to satisfy his restlessness. But if Henry felt betrayal, real or imagined, his temper snapped like a whip. And when it snapped, someone always paid. Treason, a word that hummed like smoke over every English household. To accuse someone of treason during Henry's reign was not a simple act. It was like lighting a bonfire in a field of dry grass. The fire spread fast, furious, and without mercy. Treason could mean speaking against the king, doubting his marriages, questioning his new church, or even hesitating to praise him loudly enough. In Henry's England, silence itself could be suspicious, and suspicion alone could send a man to the Tower. The Tower's night, where hope died before dawn, the Tower of London was more than stone and iron. It was a mood, cold, heavy, ghost-ridden. Prisoners who entered the Traitor's Gate felt the river's chill seep into their blood. The air inside the tower tasted of damp rope, old prayers, and fear that clung to the walls like mold. Some prisoners waited days, some waited weeks, some waited with no date at all. At night, the tower shifted and moaned with the wind. Guards heard footsteps when no one walked. Prisoners whispered half-forgotten memories to keep their minds from unraveling. And sometimes, only sometimes, the king himself passed near the tower, his torchlight flickering like judgment on the water. Interrogation, the king's truth carved from flesh. Henry rarely attended interrogations, but his presence was felt in every question. Those conducting the questioning knew what answers needed to be found, or fabricated. And they knew the cost of failing to find them. Some prisoners confessed before a single question was asked. The knowledge of who wanted answers was enough. Others endured nights where screams echoed into the river mist. England pretended not to hear. Execution days. When the kingdom held its breath, no matter how many times London witnessed executions, each one carried the weight of something sacred and terrifying. When the morning bell rang and footsteps marched toward the scaffold, the crowd gathered not only from fear, but from fascination. A powerful man brought low reminded everyone that the king's judgment was absolute. On those mornings, Henry often stayed in his palace, but always in a room where he could hear the church bells. He listened to the rhythm of justice like a conductor listening to a symphony. And as the axe fell, a chapter closed, a warning was delivered, and the king's authority pulsed stronger than ever. The council, men who ruled under the shadow of a crown. Henry's council chamber was a battlefield without swords. Men fought with words, glances, and cautious alliances. One wrong statement could end a career, a lineage, or a life. The tension inside that room felt like a taut string ready to snap. Sometimes Henry slammed his fist on the table so hard the candles trembled. Other times he laughed suddenly, unpredictably, stunning the room into silence. His moods were tides, powerful, unstoppable, and often dangerous. The council learned a simple truth: a king who could break a church could break anything. A kingdom that loved and feared its monarch. For all his brutality, England did not despise Henry. His people respected his strength. They admired his certainty. They believed, or chose to believe, that every execution was necessary, every punishment righteous, every decision the act of a king protecting his realm. Because fear alone cannot hold a kingdom, but are mixed with fear, that becomes legend. And Henry VIII ruled like he wanted to be remembered. Not as a man, but as an era. The king's final years, a body falling apart, a mind unraveling. By the time Henry VIII reached the final stretch of his life, the brilliant golden prince of his youth was long gone. In his place stood a man shaped, carved, by pain, paranoia, and the crushing weight of a crown he once believed he was born to wear effortlessly. His story, once filled with music, feasts, tournaments, and beautiful queens, now shifted into something darker. Something heavy, swollen, and haunted. In his younger years, Henry had been the physical ideal of Renaissance royalty: tall, athletic, broad-shouldered, glowing with health. But age is a patient hunter, and it found him, slowly at first, then all at once. By his late 40s, the king who once danced like sunlight on marble floors could barely walk without groaning in agony. The famous jousting accident of 1536, where Henry was thrown from his horse and crushed beneath its weight, had left him with a severe leg injury that never healed. The wound reopened again and again, turning into an ulcer that stank so fiercely courtiers had to hold perfumed cloths to their noses while standing near him. Pain became his constant companion. He ate to escape it. He drank to soothe it. He raged because of it. The once chiseled king ballooned to nearly 400 pounds, his movements stiff and slow, his breathing heavy and labored. Every step hurt. Every night burned with fever. Every morning began with blood, bandages, and a temper ready to explode at the slightest provocation. And with physical collapse came the unraveling of his mind. Henry VIII always believed he was chosen by God, anointed, destined, unstoppable. But as his body decayed, that belief twisted into something darker, the fear that God might be angry with him, that the ghosts of his past had begun to circle his bed like silent judges. He had executed friends, fathers, monks, queens. He had broken the church. He had rewritten the laws of heaven and earth. And now, in the quiet hours of night, those decisions came back to whisper in his dreams. Witnesses spoke of the king waking in terror, shouting orders at shadows no one else could see. Some said he muttered names in his sleep, and Bullen, Thomas More, Cromwell, names he had sent to the block. Others insisted he prayed with a trembling voice, begging for forgiveness he would never publicly admit needing. The once crowded court around him grew colder, quieter, and more cautious. No one wanted to be noticed by a dying king. His moods swung like swords. One morning he was tender and tearful, speaking fondly of his children. By afternoon he could erupt in fury, demanding arrests, executions, or confessions that did not exist. Courtiers learned to read his face like sailors reading a stormy sea. One wrong word, one wrong tone, one unlucky moment could end a life. And yet Henry was not merely a tyrant in decline. There was also tragedy in him, deep, bruised tragedy. The loneliness of power pressed on him harder than ever. He had lost 5 wives. One betrayed him. One he cast aside. One gave him a son only to die. One he loved with the quiet devotion of a man who knows he doesn't deserve peace. And one remained alive but far away from him, the ghost of a marriage he had ended with dismissal instead of death. His children were his remaining light. Edward, the fragile promise of Tudor continuity. Mary, the daughter he once disowned, now a symbol of redemption. Elizabeth, the brilliant spark of Anne Boleyn reborn. Even through the fog of pain, Henry's mind sharpened when he spoke of them. They were his legacy, the living pages of the book he had spent decades writing in blood and gold. In his final years, Henry VIII ruled England like a lion wounded but still dangerous. The council feared him. Foreign ambassadors tiptoed in his presence. Even the Queen, Catherine Parr, navigated his moods with the precision of a scholar and the courage of a soldier. She soothed him, reasoned with him, calmed the storms inside him. Some days she succeeded. Other days, even she could barely reach the man trapped beneath the weight of his own legend. And as the king's world shrank, his mobility failing, his chambers darkened, his body swollen beyond recognition, the realm around him remained tense, breathless, waiting. For when a king like Henry VIII dies, he does not slip quietly into history. He drags an arrow with him. But before that final moment arrived, there were the long evenings, where the once mighty monarch sat under heavy velvet canopies, staring into the fire with eyes that remembered every face he had loved and destroyed. His crown no longer felt like destiny, it felt like penance. His body no longer felt like a gift, it felt like a prison. And his mind, once sharp enough to command a continent, now drifted between guilt, grandeur, fear, and fading light. Henry VIII had changed England forever. But in these final years, England watched him change too, from a radiant young prince into a king bowed not by enemies, but by time itself. The kingdom after Henry, a legacy of fire, fear, and unfinished dreams. When Henry VIII finally left the world he had shaped and shattered in equal measure, England did not breathe a sigh of relief, it held its breath. Because a king like Henry does not simply die. His shadow stays. His decisions echo. His wives become myths. His heirs become battlegrounds before they ever take the throne. The Tudor sun did not set with him. If anything, it flared brighter, hotter, more dangerous in the hands of the children he left behind. The kingdom he departed in 1547 was not the same England he inherited as a dancing, laughing, golden-haired prince. This was a land bruised and reborn. A land where monasteries were piles of stone, where saints had been declared traitors, where the church itself had been torn from the pope and fastened to the crown like a chained animal. The people were weary. The nobles were cautious. The counselors were hungry. Everyone knew the truth. Henry may be gone, but his legacy was a roaring storm still rolling across the horizon. At the center of this storm sat a child, Edward VI, Henry's precious boy, the son he had prayed for, fought for, destroyed for. Edward was only 9 years old when he inherited the throne. A quiet child, delicate in health, brilliant in mind, raised by scholars to be a Protestant prince. He adored learning, disliked conflict, and trusted adults far more than he should have. That made him the perfect canvas for powerful men to paint their ambitions upon. The Regency Council that governed in Edward's name was a nest of claws, dukes, earls, ambitious nobles who had waited years for this moment. They seized lands Henry had confiscated, pushed Protestant reforms harder than even Henry had dared, and battled one another for control of the boy king's mind. England, barely stitched together after decades of religious upheaval, was thrust into a new wave of change. Churches were stripped. Images destroyed. Latin prayers swept away. The old world was burning, and a new one was rising, but the kingdom trembled beneath the speed of it. Edward watched it all with a calm, bookish fascination. But the boy's health betrayed him. Thin frame, persistent illness, a body that seemed too fragile for the weight of the Tudor crown. Within 6 years he was coughing blood. Within 7, fading. And Henry's fiercely protected heir slipped away like a candle in winter wind. England panicked. Another child gone. Another Tudor dream fractured. And the next heir waiting in line carried a legacy as heavy as Henry's own conscience. His eldest daughter, Mary. Mary Tudor had lived through humiliation, abandonment, and political erasure. Once declared illegitimate, separated from her mother, forbidden to see Catherine of Aragon even as she lay dying, Mary carried scars Henry never saw, or never wanted to see. And when she took the throne, she brought with her not just the Catholicism of her upbringing, but the pain of a lifetime seeking justice. England became a battlefield of faith. Protestants who had benefited under Edward's reign found themselves hunted, tried, burned. Mary's determination to restore England to Rome was fierce, unyielding. She saw it as redemption, for her mother, for herself, for the wounds Henry had carved into the heart of the kingdom. But to the people, she became something else, Bloody Mary. A name born not from her heart, but from fire and fear. Yet even Mary's reign, intense as it was, did not last. Her health faltered. Her hopes of motherhood vanished. Her marriage to Philip of Spain brought anxiety instead of unity. And when she died, England once again looked to a Tudor child shaped by a dead king's choices, Elizabeth. Elizabeth I, daughter of Anne Boleyn, the girl branded illegitimate by her own father, stepped into the storm with steel in her spine and brilliance in her eyes. If Henry had ever wondered whether his daughter would survive the chaos he left behind, she answered him with a reign that would redefine the world. Elizabeth inherited a kingdom divided by faith, scarred by executions, drained by war, suspicious of the crown. But she moved with a master's touch, slow, cautious, deliberate. She balanced Catholic and Protestant, soothed nobles, calmed foreign powers, and built a government that relied on intellect rather than bloodshed. Where Henry broke bonds, Elizabeth forged them. Where Henry demanded loyalty, Elizabeth inspired it. Where Henry used fear, Elizabeth used charm and cunning. And yet even her glory, her golden age of exploration, theater, and diplomacy, carried the imprint of Henry's hand. For the religious settlement she crafted was built upon the ruins of Henry's break with Rome. Her steely independence was born from watching her father's marriages destroy women. Her suspicion of intimacy grew from witnessing how easily Henry's love became execution. Her refusal to marry, her choice to rule alone, was not merely strategy, it was survival. Henry VIII had wanted a dynasty that would dominate Europe. Instead, he created a lineage of children who fought, bled, and labored under the weight of his ambition. A boy king who died too young. A queen who ruled with fire. A queen who ruled with brilliance. England after Henry was a kingdom walking through smoke, sometimes choking, sometimes shining, always shaped by the fires he lit. His legacy was not peace. It was not unity. It was motion. A kingdom always shifting, always struggling, always reaching for the power he once held in those massive, ring-covered hands. And as history moved forward, one truth became undeniable: Henry VIII did not just rule England. He remade it into a land that would spend generations learning to live with the scars, the victories, and the unanswered questions he left behind.